Hello, my name is Josh Gilliland, and welcome to another session of The Legal Geeks. Today, Jessica and I will be discussing the century-old John Carter of Mars series. So we're going to be saluting a century of science fiction today. And Jessica, this is one of your early science fiction loves. So why don't you tell the world a little bit about the author of John Carter of Mars?
The author of John Carter of Mars, who's actually mentioned in the movie, or actually is a character in the movie, but I don't think a lot of people realize this, is Edgar Burroughs. And he's probably one of the earliest authors that I fell in love with. I read his Tarzan series first. That's probably what he's best known for. Is he also created a century ago the character of Tarzan, and obviously turned that into an industry that everyone knows today. After he did Tarzan, well, he actually started also a century ago. He wrote a piece. He was, had been in a series of low-end jobs and had plenty of time to read the pulp fiction magazines of the day. And he wasn't that impressed with the writing in those magazines and thought he could write as well as any of them. And so a century ago, he did. He published his first piece in one of them called Under the Moon of Mars, which was the inspiration for what he referred to and I refer to as the Barsoom series. Barsoom was his fictional name for Mars, and he wrote a series of books starting with A Princess of Mars that was published in 1917. And A Princess of Mars, the plot of that is basically what they turned into the movie that Disney released this year called John Carter.
And we'll talk more about the movie in a few minutes, but let's look at, first off, a little about the historical context. This was released in 1912. And there's a lot of things were happening then in the world. We were having the progressive era in the United States with the mindset that we could fix things and government could be used for a force of good that Herbert Crowley wrote about, that inspired Theodore Roosevelt to run for president again in 1912. And a bunch of other things took place as well. You start seeing the growing of the Boy Scouts are growing in both the United States and in England. Sea Scout starts as well in 1912 in the United States. And there's a lot of good stuff happening in the world in 1912. Things change when war comes, but at that point in time, lots of good things are happening. So let's look at the.
Also, sorry, I have to jump in. There's also a lot of science exploration at that time. Obviously, modern science was beginning, and in fact, Edgar Rice Burroughs was inspired to create this Barsoom series and these creatures on Mars by a scientist who was claiming that there were canals on Mars, and that those canals were evidence of that people or something had lived on Mars at a time. Obviously, that scientist was later disproven, but that scientific idea was part of the inspiration for the Barsoom series.
And also, let's see what Curiosity finds when we land on Mars again, and if there, because there's something there, and whether or not it's a microbe or not, we'll see. But as Jules Verne had huge impact on his time, and that we still feel today, many over a century later. What influences did the John Carter of Mars series have on science and literature that we see today?
Edgar Rice Burroughs is obviously, we talked about, with Jules Verne, one of the earliest to kick off modern science fiction as we know it. And in fact, I think the Barsoom series and this idea of traveling to another planet where you encounter people and creatures and monsters that aren't here on this planet and having the adventures there is obviously spurred an entire genre, basically. I mean, you can Serenity and Firefly from Joss Whedon, obviously kind of the cowboy and the adventurer explorer. He did obviously inspire Robert Heinlein, one of my other favorite sci-fi authors. He inspired Ray Bradbury. So he had a huge influence on the idea of what science fiction could be. He also inspired scientists. Carl Sagan and I share in common a love for Dejah Thoris, John Carter, and Tars Tarkas. I didn't do much with that love besides become a legal geek, where Carl Sagan took that idea that, there could be life out there among the stars, and he obviously spent a lifetime studying that. So Edgar Rice Burroughs and the Barsoom series had a large influence on society today that I don't think a lot of people realize.
Agreed, and we can see that as the story of John Carter of Mars is, echoes in different characters. Could you highlight some of those characters that follow some of the same character traits of John Carter?
Well, John Carter was known for being brave, very principled, always willing to help out somebody who's fighting unbelievable odds. He also obviously goes to other, planets and falls in love with the beautiful, wonderful princess. So you could argue that he's like Captain Kirk. A little bit like Superman, where again, very brave, very principled, always does the right thing. So I think there are probably a lot of the romantic leads in science fiction and adventure movies that take some inspiration from John Carter.
I think the Superman connection is fairly substantial when you look at leaping tall buildings in a single bound, which
That's
was
true.
and what's John Carter doing on Mars because of the different gravity and we look at the Superman character and the original heritage there, from going from a planet with a red star and I guess higher gravity potentially to one with a yellow star and the energy from the star giving him his abilities and thus able to do all those magnificent things. You can see the parallels with John Carter, which again, that was 1912,
Yeah.
and in 1917 with your first book. So again, very very forward thinking because I don't think there was anything else quite like that
Yeah.
at the beginning of the 20th century. And again, maybe there was someplace, but it's a century standing. Now, I don't think people realize how prolific Edgar Rice Burroughs was. How many John Carter books did he write? And how many Tarzan ones, for that matter, if you know?
I don't know. He wrote a lot of Tarzan books, I know. And in fact, he then decided that he wanted to, he was one of also the early marketing geniuses.
Yeah.
He wanted to expand Tarzan in particular because that was an instant sensation into comic strips and, movies and other merchandising ideas.
That's right.
He was actually heavily advised against doing any of that and did it obviously to huge success. So it's like he didn't listen to the doubters. But John Carter, the Barsoom series had 12 books in the series, I think. And then his son actually wrote some sort of follow-up that I think was the only one actually called John Carter of Mars. But the Barsoom series had 12. He also wrote about traveling to Venus. Like Jules Verne, he was interested with traveling to the center of the earth. So he had explorers who did that as well. He also did westerns and romance novels. So he was very prolific.
And not everyone realizes that today. When you look at today's authors, it's like I'll go crank out 12 books about a character and the different adventures. You see that some, like again, you get the Tom Clancy's and the Stephen Kuntz who do, the techno war novel types that get presidents to sit down and go, wow, that's impressive. But it's a very exclusive club.
Yeah.
Of authors who can be that prolific, and that's truly amazing.
Yeah.
So, since you're fluent in all the books, and you probably speak a little Martian, could you tell us the premise of the story from A Princess of Mars and how that then evolves in the following books?
The idea of A Princess of Mars is that John Carter is a Civil War vet who is exploring for gold, and he ends up basically in this magical cave. They were trying to escape from he and his partner were trying to escape from hostile Native Americans, and he ends up actually frozen in this cave and then is magically transported to Mars, and he wakes up naked. Most of the people on Mars, it's a hot planet, so they actually had many more clothes in the movies than they do in the books, but he ends up there on Mars. He does fall in first with the green men of Mars, and at first he's a prisoner. But as you alluded to before, and as you can tell from the movies, he's already a great warrior, very strong, very agile. But with the lesser gravity of Mars, he's also even stronger and can jump and bounce and do all these things. So while he originally starts off as a prisoner, he basically quickly becomes actually a warrior in one of the tribes of the Green Men of Mars. And then what the idea behind the Barsoom series is that Mars is a dying planet and that it's filled with many different races and species who are basically battling over those, remaining resources. And of course, the idea too, Edgar Rice Burroughs was obviously inspired by the god of the Greco-Roman god Mars, the warrior god. And so they're all very warlike. And John Carter, again, while he won't ever start a fight and he doesn't want to cause unnecessary death, is obviously very good in a war and is always willing to battle for what he thinks is right. So he quickly impresses and actually starts to bring together many of the different groups of Mars. So That's a basic idea.
Also, with the books, there's telepathy between all the Martians as part of their forms of communication. And could you speak a little to that and how that was worked into the story?
Well, one of the ideas is that everyone on Mars has to tell the truth all the time. In part because they do have this telepathy and they can share thoughts, so it's very hard to lie. John Carter, however, again, the idea is that he's an Earthman, so it's different somehow. Well, he can read other people's thoughts, even when they try to block them. Nobody can read his thoughts. And so one of the things that he actually can do, which is pointed out in the book, is not always a bad thing, is when necessary, he can actually lie, which does come in handy and actually can save people. But yes, in fact, in the books, he uses that ability to read minds even when others try to block him from reading their minds. He uses it both to save his own skin, and ultimately at the end of Princess of Mars, he uses that ability to restart a generator that basically provides the atmosphere for Mars. And so he does use his powers with the telepathy throughout the books, but it's not as emphasized, of course, as his great warrior-like abilities.
Fascinating. Now, what were some of the main differences between the film and the original material?
There were obviously, the plot was different. The Therns were like the bad guys in this movie. There are Therns in the Barsoom series, but they're really just another race of Martian people, I guess. And so they don't have all the special powers that they have in the movie. I didn't actually mind that difference, however, because I did like the idea that they were going to set up the Therns as kind of the big bad that would be the ongoing, opponent, the ongoing evil to John Carter. So I thought that could have worked well in the movie. So I was not opposed to that change. The changes I didn't like is how they weakened some of the characters. Tardos Mors in particular, Dejah Thoris's father, in both the book and the movie, Sab Than, who's the invading big bad, wants to marry Dejah Thoris. In the movie, Tardos Mors agrees to the marriage to save his people of the city-state of Helium. In the book, again, these are all very honorable, very principled people who would rather die than face dishonor. He is not willing to force his daughter to marry Sab Than, and in fact, the people of Helium support him in that. So the fact that he kind of basically did take the cowardly way out in the movie was disappointing. And I felt that way about John Carter too, and I do think that was a big misstep. For some reason, they decided that they had to give John Carter this tragic backstory in the movie that he doesn't have in the books, where he has a child and a wife that are tragically killed. So he becomes very bitter, very just greedy, I guess, and self-interested and selfish. And so in the movies, even after he's transported to Mars, for a while there, he isn't as admirable and brave and pure as he is in the books. And so I thought that was a shame that they had to water him down with what I thought was an unnecessary, tragic backstory that just took away part of what I loved about John Carter, which is how brave and principled he was and how he was never selfish and how he was always there to help other people. So I thought that was a disappointment that they made that change.
Yeah, I've noticed with some of the comic book movies and the other sci-fi movies that if you stay close to the source material, the movie tends to be more successful. Yeah. And when you do a radical course change, that tends to upset people.
Especially when you change the main character.
Yeah, and so there are things that you can change for consistency purposes, like with the Spider-Man movies in the early 2000s. Tobey Maguire, was able to shoot webs out of himself, and that was like the only big change. They didn't, he didn't build the web slingers himself.
Right.
And they did change that with the 2012 movie. But, again, just one of those differences. And but that was the only major difference. Sometimes it works. The original X-Men movie, where they had uniforms instead of everyone in yellow costumes, that sort of thing, that worked. But when you, kind of violate the main character, that's a problem, and but on the flip side, when you have source material that's a century old, that's kind of established precedent at that point.
That's right.
There are a lot of people out there who've read it, so. Those were some mild deviations between them, but overall, I do think I thought the movie had more heart than the Star Wars prequels, and
That's a pretty low standard, but I would agree.
Yeah, it's more heart, and so it's heartbreaking that it didn't do better, and I hold I think it was a victim of bad marketing. Taking the name of Mars out of it was a mistake, and they didn't highlight that this was, the story a century ago that launched science fiction as we know it.
Yeah, I think I actually ended up not seeing it. I was originally very excited to see the movie in the theaters, and then both between obviously the bad reviews and then also the trailers had made it look like it was a lot different. I actually took away the impression that it was going to be very different from the books, and I wasn't too keen on that. I actually ended up being both pleasantly surprised by how true to a lot of the ideas in the book it was, and I guess it's also the beauty of low expectations. When I finally did watch the DVD, I wasn't expecting much, so I was pleasantly surprised by the movie itself. And even Taylor Kitsch. At first, I had not been keen on the idea of him as John Carter. I thought he did a capable job, not a brilliant job as John Carter, but I thought he was not horribly cast in that role. So I think poor Taylor Kitsch has just had a rough year that he doesn't really deserve.
No, it's, when you're a victim of either bad writing, as in the case of Battleship, where, they just needed one rewrite probably and that could have tightened up that film. Because I could perfectly have no problem believing a battleship could give an alien spaceship a broadside. Sure. The 8-year-old in me wanted to see that happen. That was a good thing. But the beginning, was horribly written with him trying to steal a chicken burrito from a convenience store, and just poorly done. And no one would be able to join the military, being that big of a screw up, and be a lieutenant in charge of, be the weapons officer on a destroyer. That seemed highly unrealistic, and so it's bad when.
That's the unrealistic part of that movie.
Yeah, and that's the ironic part. It's like I can believe the alien invasion traveling faster than the speed of light than I could the rank advancement of a guy who got in trouble for stealing a chicken burrito and had to join the Navy. That's the part I can't believe. And that wasn't his fault. That was bad writing. And in the case of John Carter, it was horrible marketing. And so it's because I think it is a good story. I hope it does well, on DVD and Blu-ray and Netflix and iTunes. And I was dedicated to Steve Jobs. And I really think that Andrew Stanton is a great director, and I hope he gets to do more.
I do too, and I hope poor Taylor Kitsch gets some more opportunities. So
I do too. He got a bad rap. So
he did.
So with that will conclude today's recording, and we'll keep talking about all things geeky in the law, in the coming weeks. So, but thank you everyone for your time, and Jessica, thank you for your expert knowledge.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
And bye. You take care now. Thanks.